Roehampton and Green Party spokesperson on economic policy, who's going to speak broadly around the subject of economics of happiness. Molly, over to you.
Thank you. Although my job title is now Professor of Strategy and Sustainability, I identify myself as a green economist, and I've been in this game for quite a few years now. I've got this slide up here just to remind myself, get myself grounded before I get going. So, I'm going to talk about three things today. I've been asked to talk about the economics of happiness. I'm slightly reinterpreting that and calling this the economics for life instead. And I'm basically asking myself three questions. What is the economy for? And in that section I'm going to discuss the way the economy that we've been living in has focused very much on money rather than on actual value. And that's a process that's known as financialisation, so I'm going to explore that a little bit. Then I'm going to ask a who question. Who do we think we are? And that's about the way we use the economy to define ourselves, and whether that's actually constructed either socially or environmentally. And lastly, I'm going to ask, where do we belong? And you'll see I'll probably get excited about this because this is the bit I tend to write about myself, and it's something I write about under the heading of Bioregional Economy. So, we all know now, and Stephen explained this, situation of money, how money is created and the extraordinary problems that's brought us. As Greens, we want to encourage the development of local economies, but actually that's something that the focus on money and the focus on the global casino approach to money has actually significantly undermined. So what money should be there for is to facilitate transactions between people within, I would say, a local community, but even if you think a larger community, that's the central role that money should be fulfilling. And it hasn't been fulfilling that role because it's been being used in international speculative circuits, basically. So this is kind of what we see, the evidence we see of the process of financialisation. What is financialisation? Well, it's a bit of an academic-y sounding word. This is a bit of an academic-y definition. The financial growth of the past few decades does not represent a subordination of public authority and political capacity to the expansionary forces of global markets, but rather has been a process whereby new organisational linkages were formed and particular relations of institutional control were constructed and consolidated. So this is kind of the academic view of financialisation. What the theorists of financialisation are arguing is that actually what's happened is that the forces of finance have kind of taken over the democratic state, really. I think we see clear evidence of this in what's happening in Greece today. So the Prime Minister of Greece is not a democratically elected politician, he's a banker who's acceptable to those people who are in charge of the euro. And we saw a similar situation in Italy. So I think what's happening in Greece is kind of like a very good example of the way in which we've lost democratic control to the financial market. This is a deeply political question. There are problems about businesses getting access to money, there are problems about the way that local economies have money sucked out of them. But it's a much more fundamental question about what it means to live in a democracy when actually the forces of finance have so much power. It's also important because of its social consequences. So some of you, like me, are probably old enough to remember the last really big BBC series about art called Civilization by Kenneth Clark. Not that one, the other one. But I was really depressed to see that there's the latest offering is something which is called How Much Is It Worth? This is Channel 4's approach to art criticism now on telly. And basically they put up a picture like this from Van Gogh, and we're not supposed to focus on like the quality of the painting or how it makes us feel or how it adds to our quality of life, but we're all supposed to guess how much money it's worth. So it's sort of somewhere in between an art show and the Antiques Roadshow. And I find this a very kind of depressing commentary on people's emphasis on money. I was at a meeting about how we're going to develop a local food economy in Stroud yesterday. Exactly the same thing happened. There is basically £37,000 in the local authority budget, and I wanted to plan to use that, but people's focus was completely on, well, how are we going to get somebody to fund what we're doing? You know, we think about the money first instead of thinking about what we're going to do first. And that's an example of the way that this process of financialisation has kind of sucked out other values and just replaced them with money. So it's very socially destructive. Here's another example. I mean, we all know what's happened in football. I mean, we've seen Glasgow Rangers go bust now, and they can lose 10 points in the league because they've gone bust financially, which, you know, to me those are like apples and pears. Okay, they're a financial disaster zone, but what does have to do with the game of football? Well, the answer is at the moment, football is about money. It's not about sport, it is about money. We see the same thing with the Olympics. So it's just another example of our experience, really, of this process of financialisation. This is what the economy's come to be about. It's come to be about money. We hear a lot from David Cameron, don't we, about a balanced economy. I don't think he probably agrees with me about what that means, but this is a graphic from 2008 and it shows just how imbalanced our economy was. So you can see how much of value that was created in our British economy was created in the finance sector. And if you compare the size of the bar that says agriculture over on the far left, I find that a little bit of a disturbing realisation about what our economy actually does. We're not creating value in the genuinely productive sectors, we're creating value in the artificially productive sectors where you can inflate value through a computer and through a sort of economic, a financial wheeze. That's what our economy's been doing, and there's the evidence. So, we're going to have a little bit of a think about that. We're going to explore whether that's always been the case. Right, who's going to tell me who this guy is? Apart from Rupert. You're on those. It's Carl Polanyi. Anyway, it's Carl Polanyi. So, I think he's one of our great economists who's been completely devalued and really is in time for a revival of interest. He wrote a great book in 1944 called The Great Transformation. And what he was arguing in that book is that we had come to be divorced from the natural way that an economy should be organised. That an economy really should be embedded in the natural environment. But what had happened was that there had been an increasing focus on what he calls here the self-regulating market system. And he was very critical of that. He was critical of the gold standard. He was critical of the way that the market system was now set up as the kind of apotheosis of human development. And as he says here, he saw that as a utopian endeavour. I tend not to use utopian in any way, but he has done that there. So it means, an ideal you'll never reach, this kind of free market that we're all trying to strive towards. And what his work is very useful in doing is in saying how very limited that view of economics is, and how for most of human history we actually looked at the economy in terms of our local land and our skills as a community, and how we could find the best possible life for ourselves using those resources. And as he says here, previously to our time, no economy has ever existed that even in principle was controlled by markets. So, those more locally based, more communitarian economies, how did they work? Well, they had these three principles that he identified here. So we've got the market as the most recent and most short-lived of the three ways of organising economic life. And the other two that he considers are reciprocity and redistribution. So reciprocity is how traditional human communities work. People do things for each other. They don't expect to be paid to do things for each other. I mean, the market mentality would be equivalent to somebody giving you a present and you then paying that present. That just feels uncomfortable. It feels unnatural and wrong. Redistribution he saw as some kind of middle way. So you might think of that as being more like the Swedish model. So you have a central organising principle that kind of accumulates the wealth and then shares it out so that it's fairly shared. Some African systems with chiefdoms work on a similar kind of principle, he argued. But as he says, this is the important conclusion, that prior to the market revolution, humanity's economic relations were subordinate to the social, whereas now economic relations are superior to the social. So we used to focus on how we worked as communities, and the economy worked within that framing. But now, as I argued with financialisation, it's the opposite way around. The economic is dominating the social, and I think that has very serious social consequences. So what could we do in policy terms to address this? Well, I think a proposal that naturally grows out of this view of human reciprocity is the proposal for citizens' income, which, as you probably know, is a Green Party policy. Okay. Oh, sorry. Oh, have I been doing that the whole time?
Just a bit.
Sorry, I will try to do better. Wave at me again if I don't do that. So, citizens' income means an automatic payment that you receive by right of being a citizen. You don't have to do anything to deserve it. So this is a kind of alternative. It's a completely different way of looking at human need from the kind of job seekers allowance model, where you're rewarded because you have worked or because you may work again in future. So welfare is attached to the labour market, whereas the citizen's income detaches that. It says, no, you deserve a livelihood because you deserve a share of the resources of the country. Yeah, I won't bother to go into the technicalities. People can ask more in the questions if they like. But how would that change the way we think about welfare? Well, as I said, citizenship becomes the basis of entitlement. So that's rethinking the way we relate to each other and rethinking the way economic value is shared. You'd also, we'd allocate this on the basis of the individual. This is a point about the welfare reforms that most people haven't grasped yet, that a lot of the welfare payments in future are going to be paid to men that have traditionally been paid to women. So child benefit is an example of that. With the new universal credit, it's likely that the majority of claimants will be men. I think that has quite serious implications in terms of household relationships. Whereas the Green policy will be to give welfare payments on the basis of the individual, and within married couples it wouldn't imply anything about your relationship. So access to citizens' income would be easy and unconditional. So this would separate your livelihood from the labour market. I think it would allow people to think in much freer and more open ways about how they make a living. It could, if you had that basic income guaranteed, you could be much freer in terms of actually setting up your own business, but also meeting your own needs directly through growing food, through building your own home, all these kind of things that at the moment people don't have time to do because they're having to prioritise earning a living to pay the bills. Citizens' income could free up that kind of human energy. Rupert referred earlier to that excellent book, The Spirit Level, and this is a graphic from The Spirit Level, which is basically asking the question, how expensive in energy terms is it to buy a good quality of life? And I was a bit wary to come and talk to you about happiness, especially now that David Cameron's onto that particular jag. But it's obviously a very difficult thing to measure. So if you're looking at whether you've got a successful economy, you need to look for useful indicators. And I really like infant mortality as an indicator because I think it's summing up a lot of different things about a society in one metric. I mean, it sums up a lot about the relationships between men and women, for example. Societies with better educated women, where women have more power, have much lower rates of infant mortality. It's also obviously telling you something about general standards of welfare, general standards of health. So what they're asking here is, how much carbon dioxide does it take to buy yourself a certain level of infant mortality, a low level of infant mortality? And you can see that different societies score completely differently on this measure. So Cuba actually has very low rates of infant mortality, which it buys extremely cheaply in energy terms. And by contrast, Bahrain also has a low level of infant mortality, but it's buying that very expensively in energy terms. And then we can look at a country like Sierra Leone. Okay, it has very low energy use, but it also has very high rates of infant mortality. So the point is, what this graphic is showing is that using more energy does not make for a healthier society if you take infant mortality as a good indicator of a healthy society, as I would argue it is. I've got 3 graphics in a row here now, but I think they're quite useful ones. This is one that just emerged from some research that was funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And the question they were asking is, are richer people, oh God, I'm just going to be nasty to rich people, are richer people more guilty in terms of climate change than poorer people? Because one of the things we often say in the Green Party is, oh, well, we can't stop people flying because it's all those, people on low incomes that want to have their week in Torremolinos or something. But actually, this research is the first really convincing evidence that that's not the case. Because what it's showing is the amount of carbon dioxide by income decile. So, the richest 10%, then the next, sorry, the poorest 10%, then the next falls up to the richest 10%, who are over here on the right. And it's got different categories, one of which is aviation. And what it shows you is that the richer you get, the more energy you use. I mean, I think that's kind of, we needn't be surprised about that, but it's quite strong evidence that that's the case. So, being wealthy, using a lot of energy as a society does not make a healthier society. Now I'm kind of moving on to say, does using more energy make you happier? But on the way, I'm just going to show you that being richer does mean that you use more energy. And so that's what my last graphic really addresses. Can you buy happiness? You might summarise this one to me. This is a graphic that came from the New Economics Foundation. And so it's measuring life satisfaction against a different level of income again. And what it's telling you basically is that the little yellow bit there at the top of each bar reduces as you come to have a higher income. That bit represents your social connections. So basically, as you work more and earn more money, you have less time to develop your friendships. And actually, if you compare the medium income and the high income, in terms of their happiness scores, they're nearly the same. But the people on medium income have stronger social connections, and that's what's making them happier. Again, I don't think this is a particularly surprising conclusion, but it is something about the way we think about the economy, and whether what we should be doing is working hard and earning a lot of money, or whether we would be better off working fewer hours and just concentrating more on our social relationships. Right, this is another kind of related point about consumption. We had our discussion at the back there about energy and why people consume so much in terms of heavy energy-intensive goods when that isn't actually adding to their well-being. I'm not exactly saying there's a conspiracy theory here, but I've done some research recently into why it is that after the last economic crisis like this one, there was a lot of focus on how to stimulate demand. I mean, within a capitalist economy, that's a rational thing to do, because if demand fails, the economy falls apart. So there was a lot of focus on both the demand side and the supply side of the economy to try and increase demand for goods. So on the demand side, we saw a lot of focus on kind of...
You're coming off your microphone again.
Oh, sorry. So on the demand side, we saw the growth of advertising and what I would see as psychological manipulation of people into buying more goods. And on the supply side, we saw the reduction in the quality of goods, the creation of built-in obsolescence. So the reason I've got a light bulb there is that this might... I'm not thinking that if you change your light bulbs, you might solve the ecological crisis. But I am thinking that if you work out what happened with the Phoebus light bulb cartel, it might help you to understand the way in which the economy is destructive in ecological terms. This was a cartel set up in 1924, and all the big light bulb manufacturers basically got together and decided what the minimum life of a light bulb should be. And I think it was 10,000 hours or something. And even at that point, they could make light bulbs last twice as long as that. But of course, if they did, they couldn't sell you another light bulb, so they were losing a lot of money. So it was basically an agreement between light bulb manufacturers to make them last less long. It's just one example of this process of built-in obsolescence. The oldest light bulb in the world is 110 years old. It's in Liverpool Fire Station in the US. And that's a picture of it. So we could make light bulbs last 110 years. 110 years ago, but now they last about 3 years. 10 minutes left, I'll get through as much as I can. This is another example of somebody writing quite unashamedly about the way in which we need to increase the amount of demand. So this is an advertising executive writing in 1955, perhaps as much as 40% of what is produced is not needed, and so if consumers exercise their option not to buy a large share of what is produced, the Great Depression is not far behind. So this was kind of said overtly back in the 50s. It's now not quite so explicitly said, but nonetheless it is one of the things that an economy, a capitalist economy, has to do in order to survive in its current structure, I would argue. I'm not arguing for these kind of opportunities. I think there are great opportunities in terms of a much happier life, and that's the bit I'm going to come on to now. This is unfortunately where most economists and business people think when they think about opportunities from the green economy. But what I'm trying to do, that's now getting very loud. Did somebody turn that up? No? Okay, I'll carry on. I always hate wandering around with this like Tom Jones, but anyway, there we are. Although I think I'm a big fan of Tom Jones, don't get me wrong. Okay, so this is the work I'm doing now about the bio-regional economy, coming soon, October 2012. What I'm trying to do is to put a bit of flesh on the bones of that idea about a local economy and what a local economy might be. So I'm trying to define that in terms of a bioregion, which is a naturally defined unit, defined by kind of nature's boundaries rather than our own political boundaries. So in my part of the world, I'm thinking of the Cotswolds as kind of natural geographical boundary. Once you think about the world in that kind of way, in terms of these natural areas, you start to realise that they have common species. That's obviously true with plants, but it's also historically been true with animals. So each local economy would have species that flourish there, and that would start to define what your local economy is like. So in Gloucestershire, that's apples, for example, and sheep. Obviously they've been imported, but nonetheless they now characterise what our economy is about. So I think this helps us to identify with our local place. It helps us to identify and build strength into our local economy. What would this mean in economic terms? Well, the aim of the bioregion would be to re-embed people's provisioning, that's to say their way of getting resources back into their local environment. And you would aim for self-sufficiency in terms of basic resources, food, products and services. Now that's not to say that we wouldn't have any kind of imports and exports at all, but certainly you would start with the local, you would try to provide for yourself locally first. I'm going to explain trade subsidiarity in a minute. Here's my daughter embedding herself in the local environment. So 4 aspects of the bioregional economy. Locality but not autarky. Autarky is a kind of economicsy word, and in economics it's a really dirty word. It means like we'll all end up like North Korea and everybody will starve. So if you say let's go for local self-reliance, conventional economists will say yes, but what about North Korea? So that's why I have to explain that we're not talking about that kind of economy. We're not talking about cutting ourselves off from other regions. What we are talking about is cultural openness and the maximisation of exchange, but putting that within the context of the very serious energy reductions that we know are necessary. So I'm working with a reduction of about 90%. What's the best kind of life we can organise for ourselves within a 90% energy reduction? So trade is now limited to those goods which are not indigenous. So there might be things that you just can't produce locally. But again, you have to take the energy limit seriously. But you know, I'm not saying you can never again have another cup of coffee, but I am saying that you might have pineapples once or twice a year, rather than whenever you fancy buying them at the supermarket. So that's what we mean. You start with the local and move outwards. I think one of the reasons we're not taking proper account of our environment is that we don't really have a sense of where our local place is. Not in my backyard is used as a sort of offensive term about people concerned about their local environment, but I see that as a completely natural response. And I think one of the things we have to do is to start sort of resuscitating people's desire to protect their local patch. And that's part of the proposal as well, because the bioregion is part of the global whole that you are responsible for. And I would suggest it's a part you can genuinely be accountable for. It's very difficult to be accountable for what happens in Shanghai or Bolivia or whatever. But, you know, if everybody took care of their local patch, then the world as a whole would be protected. So I'm seeing the bioregion as a proposal that also includes the possibility of much greater accountability. I mean, I've already been slightly critical of the limitations of the market economy, but I'd like to propose more positively what the bioregional economy could offer in terms of strengthening communities. This is a picture of us putting up bean sticks at the community farm. When I showed this in the southwest, somebody said, is that some elaborate form of Morris dancing? It's not, I can promise you. So the proponents of degrowth talk about putting the economy in its place. And what they're saying is, you know, the economy has to be social, the market has to be within social boundaries, that the social comes before the economic, as Polanyi argued. And they characterise the market as an agora, using that Greek word for the market, where, okay, there were stalls, people sold things, but also there was a lot of social exchange, there was a lot of chat about politics. It was a much more social space to replace the sort of thin, narrow transactions that we have today. And I'd also argue that the breakdown of communities that we see as a result of people not having a proper sense of their own identity in their work. You know, if one person is the butcher and one's the baker and one's the candlestick maker, and then you exchange those things, it's building a different kind of community from everybody sitting in front of a computer and people's work. Actually, it's very difficult for a lot of people to describe what it is that they do, but we kind of know that they probably spend most of their life sitting in front of a computer. Oh, it's great. I wasn't the first person to introduce Ivan Illich into the discussion today, because somebody did it in our workshop. So, of the many great things that Ivan Illich wrote, one of them was his invention of this term conviviality, or anyway, his kind of focus on this term. So, replacing productivity with conviviality. So instead of focusing on how economically efficient we can be, how much stuff we can produce, we're thinking about social outcomes, we're thinking about the quality of our lives. And as he says here, it's the opposite of industrial productivity. He means an autonomous and creative intercourse among persons, and the intercourse of persons with their environment. So it's seeing our economic relationships as very much relational, helping us to make closer relationships with our environment, with other non-human animals, and also with the species that make up our ecosystem. And as he argues here, in any society, as conviviality is reduced below a certain level, no amount of industrial productivity can effectively satisfy the needs it creates among society's members. Because we are social animals, that's where we get, as I showed in the graphic previously, that's where we get our life satisfaction from. And what we're getting at the moment is a huge amount of stuff, which is ecologically destructive when it's produced, and actually the whole consumption pattern is also not only socially unsatisfying, but actually socially destructive, I would argue. So that's basically it. Did you do some publicity on this, Rupert?
Well, we have a nice slide.
There we are, nice slide. So this is, as Rupert's probably explained, Greenhouse was set up in the summer as a think tank to focus on ideas around radical ecologism, and we've got a major project on growth that we're looking at the moment. And my last advertising slide is about my book, which I've got a sample copy over here. It's not original work, I wouldn't say. It's an attempt to bring together all the stuff I learned about green economics from the people who've been developing this for the past 30 years. And my second book there is kind of looking at how other types of economists have dealt with the environmental issue. So that's a much more pluralist view. That's all. Thank you very much.